Me, 36, name's Trevor, been a senior operations analyst at Hartwell Strategy Group. For the last 8 years, mid-sized consulting and brand advisory company, around that long. You get used to weird office drama. Thought I'd seen all of it. Already turns out I had not. This whole thing started as one of those polished corporate ideas that was supposed to prove a point. Instead, it ended up proving something nobody in management was actually trying to prove. Watching it happen completely changed to the way I look at teamwork and productivity and why some offices actually work, while others quietly fall apart. Not because of the people in them, but because of the way those people are allowed to function together. Need to explain what Hartwell was like before everything got flipped upside down. Because the before and after is basically the whole story. Company had roughly 160 employees, worked out of this clean open concept office with glass conference rooms and shared project areas. The whole layout was built around people talking to each other, quick questions across desks, random conversations that turned into useful ideas. Teams pulling in whoever they needed without making it a whole production culture. Was pretty polished but still easygoing, not fake startup, fun, just a place where most people actually got along. People generally liked being there, and yeah. Every workplace has annoyances, but most of us felt like Hartwell was somewhere smart. People could do solid work and actually get credit for it. Our teams were mixed in basically every possible way. Different backgrounds, different specialties, different personalities, different ways of looking at the same problem all thrown together. Because the work itself needed, that most of our client stuff depended on people with different strengths, bouncing ideas off each other. I worked with men and women every single day, never really stopped to think about it much, because the only thing anybody serious cared about was whether the work got done right and whether the client was happy. With the result, that system had worked for the company for more than a decade, built a strong reputation, brought in really capable employees, also brought in major clients willing to trust us with expensive high-stakes projects. Then about a year and a half ago, leadership shifted. Our old division, head stepped down, after like 2 decades in the role, left a pretty big vacuum. Whoever filled that seat was obviously going to have a huge effect on how the whole department ran. The person who got promoted was a manager named Vanessa, 43 years old, had only been with the company around 4 years. Smart, polished, very confident, very specific ideas about office culture, and very specific ideas about how teams were supposed to be built, to be fair to her. Vanessa wasn't some cartoon villain. She was sharp, spoke well, and honestly seemed to believe she was improving things, especially for the women in the department. She felt they weren't reaching their full potential in the setup we already had during her first couple months in charge. She launched what she called a full review of department dynamics. She interviewed employees, sat in on meetings, watched how people interacted, looked over performance reports and internal feedback. The conclusion she came to was that women in the office were being limited by subtle stuff inside the mixed gender environment, men speaking over people in meetings, women getting interrupted more collaborative communication styles getting overlooked in favor of louder, more aggressive ones, stuff like that. And none of those concerns sounded ridiculous on their own. Most of us took them seriously because there actually is real research on those kinds of workplace dynamics. So the general mood was basically okay. Maybe she'll suggest better meeting rules or some targeted changes or clearer systems for how people contribute something normal, something specific. Instead, she rolled out an idea. None of us were remotely expecting a total redesign of the office floor, split by gender, 2 separate sections of the building, women in one wing, men in the other. The women's side would become what she literally described as a collaborative haven, a space free from the dynamics she believed were suppressing their performance. The men's side would keep operating more or less normally, just in its own separate area. She presented the whole thing, like she fully believed it would unlock everybody's potential, said that if women were removed from those mixed gender pressures, they'd thrive in ways they hadn't been able to. Before also said the men would adapt just fine to functioning more independently, and that overall productivity would not suffer. I still remember sitting in that meeting when she announced it, looking around the room at everybody else, trying to figure out if I was misunderstanding what I was hearing. Half the faces looked confused, the other half looked worried. Nobody seemed sure whether this was an actual plan or the kind of half-baked proposal that gets floated and then quietly dropped after somebody higher up says absolutely not. People started asking the obvious questions. What happens to workflows when teams that have worked side by side for years get physically split up? How are client accounts supposed to run smoothly when the specialists assigned to the same projects are suddenly stuck in different parts of the building? Vanessa heard all of that, nodded through. It said she understood the concerns, but kept insisting the upside of the new setup would be bigger than the disruption. Claimed the adjustment period would be temporary. Also said she had already thought through the logistics in detail, which, at the time, was not especially comforting. The office remodel took about 2 weeks. Construction crews came in and started building actual walls through what had been open space for years. Watching that happen was surreal. One day, it was the normal floor plan. We all knew next day there were studs, drywall, plastic sheets, ladders, saw noise. The whole thing, by the end of it, the office had been cut into 2 separate zones. They were only connected by one main corridor leading to the shared break areas and common facilities. Seeing those walls go up honestly felt wrong, not in some dramatic legal sense, just in a basic practical sense, like watching somebody deliberately break the thing the office had originally been designed to do still. Most of us tried not to go into it with a bad attitude. Figured maybe it would be weird at first and then settle down. Figured we should at least give it a fair shot before deciding it was a disaster. Once the construction wrapped, the split was official. Women's wing had around 60 people. Men's wing had around 75. Both sides were now supposed to function, almost like separate departments. Interaction was reduced to whatever was absolutely necessary for projects to keep moving. The first few days after the separation were awkward as hell. Everybody was adjusting to this new reality where the people you used to work beside every day were suddenly on the other side of a wall. Stuff that used to happen naturally now needed messages scheduled, check-ins, formal handoffs, new channels for communication, new little systems for things nobody had needed a system for. Before, on our side, there was definitely some confusion. At first, we had to figure out how to operate without coworkers we'd been synced with for years. Some of those women had been direct project partners on major client accounts. So naturally, the first reaction was, okay, how exactly is this supposed to keep working? But then something happened that caught me off guard, and honestly seemed to catch everybody off guard, because over the next few weeks, the 2 wings started developing in completely different ways in the men's wing. This weird calm settled over the place almost right away. Not silence exactly, just a quieter kind of focus. People adapted to the new setup and slipped into their own work patterns fast, without the constant social motion of the old open office. A lot of us found it easier to stay locked in on one thing for longer. We were getting bigger, uninterrupted blocks of time, able to sit with difficult problems and actually think them through, less random interruption, less bouncing between topics every 15 minutes, less getting pulled out of deep work, because somebody nearby wanted quick input on something unrelated. The vibe wasn't hostile or cold. People still talked, still coordinated, still asked for help when they needed it. But there was this unspoken rule that if somebody was clearly in the zone, you let them stay there. Nobody needed to say it. Everybody just kind of respected it. Guy named Ryan sat a few desks over from me, senior analyst, smart dude, usually buried in the forecasting models after about a week. He said he'd gotten more serious thinking done in 7 days than he had in the previous 5 weeks. Not because the old setup had been terrible, just because this one happened to fit the way he worked a lot better. Marcus, one of the project leads who had hated the whole idea at first, admitted something similar, said managing his workload had gotten easier because he wasn't constantly switching mental gears all day, less social noise, less context, jumping less, starting one task, getting pulled into another, then having to claw his way back into the first one. I noticed it too. My own work started moving faster. I was finishing complicated analysis jobs quicker and making fewer mistakes, mostly because I finally had longer stretches where I could stay focused on details without getting broken out of it every 20 minutes. Meanwhile, over in the women's wing, things apparently were going very differently. Need to be careful here, because I wasn't physically over there. So some of this came from private conversations, and some of it became obvious later when department-wide numbers started circulating. But from what I heard, the collaborative setup Vanessa had imagined was not really clicking instead of smoother teamwork. There were longer meetings, more discussion before any decision got finalized, more energy spent reaching full agreement on stuff that used to get resolved quickly, and apparently there were interpersonal tensions too. Not dramatic screaming matches or anything, just the kind of friction that can build when a group is pushed to function a certain way, whether or not that way actually suits the work, important part. Here as this was not, because women are somehow less efficient or more emotional or naturally worse at working together, that would be a lazy and stupid conclusion. What it actually seemed to be about was the structure Vanessa built. She designed the experiment around a very specific theory, and that theory ended up encouraging certain habits and expectations that did not help the work as much as she thought they would. A coworker named Claire, who I'd worked with for years before the split, messaged me privately after maybe 3 weeks. She was frustrated and not in a vague way, in a very tired, specific way. She described an environment where every choice seemed to require way too much group input, where decisions dragged because everybody was expected to consult everybody, where sometimes the lack of different perspectives made the whole group drift toward the same assumptions, and where normal social dynamics that exist in any group of humans were actually getting stronger instead of calmer. She was also careful about how she said. It made a point of telling me she didn't think this proved anything about gender itself. In her view, it was about how the whole experiment had been designed, and about the pressure their side was under to operate according to an ideological model that sounded good on paper, but was not working very well in practice by the end of the first month. The numbers were telling a story Vanessa definitely had not planned for, and it was a story she was now having to explain to upper leadership, who had been watching this whole experiment pretty closely. Our side, the men's wing, showed a pretty noticeable jump in output, not because we had suddenly become harder workers overnight, not because anyone was grinding longer hours. It was mostly because the quieter setup happened to match the kind of heavy analytical work a lot of our projects required. People were getting more done because they could actually stay locked into difficult tasks without constant disruption. The women's wing, from what the data showed, was trending the other way. Their output was down, not because they lacked talent, not because they were not trying, and not because anybody over there was lazy. It looked like the structure itself was slowing things down. Too much built around constant collaboration, too much extra discussion, too much consensus. Building layered on top of work that still needed to actually get finished. Need to stop here for a second, because this part matters. I do not want this turning into some dumb takeaway about men being better workers than women. That was not what the data proved, and it would be both inaccurate and gross to act like it did. What the data actually showed was way narrower than that. It showed that this specific setup with this exact structure, with these exact expectations, produced these exact results in this one company, at this one moment. That has all changed the structure, and you could easily get different outcomes. In fact, Claire and a few other women basically said exactly that. In the conversations that followed, they were not arguing against collaboration. They were saying the problem was the way it had been forced into everything. No balance, no protected focus time, no real flexibility. Once month 2 started, Vanessa was getting squeezed from both directions. Leadership wanted answers about why the two sides were drifting so far apart. And people inside the department wanted to know what the plan was to fix something that was getting harder and harder to ignore. At first, she tried to reframe the numbers, said the women's wing was building things the metrics could not fully capture, stronger relationships, better collaborative habits, a healthier and more sustainable way of working. To be fair, that argument was not completely empty. Productivity metrics do miss some things. They do not capture every useful part of how teams function, but that explanation stopped working. Once the gap started affecting actual deliverables, clients do not care about your internal theory of collaboration. If the work is late, and that became a real problem, fast the whole thing hit a breaking point when one of our biggest client projects started slipping behind schedule. This was not some small account nobody cared about. This was a major long-term client. The kind you do not mess around with. The project needed specialists from both wings to finish properly. And because those people were now physically separated, every handoff took longer, every clarification took longer, every little coordination step had extra friction built into it. Delays started stacking on top of delays, and these were delays that pretty clearly would not have happened under the old integrated setup. Client trust started taking a hit, which is the kind of thing companies panic over For good reason, Vanessa had no choice at that point. She had to approve temporary cross-wing collaboration just to save the project. And that, by itself, basically admitted the whole split structure was not working for the way the company actually operated. The next part, I did not know in real time. I only learned it later once the full mess came out, apparently. Once Vanessa was stuck with results that contradicted her whole vision, and leadership was pressing harder for an explanation. She started trying to massage the performance reporting not in some movie villain way, not like she was inventing numbers out of thin air. It was more subtle than that selective presentation, favorable framing, choosing versions of the data that made the women's wing look stronger than it really was. But subtle or not, it was still enough to cross a line, and one of the people on her own side was not willing to go along with it. There was an analyst over there named Natalie. She had actually supported the experiment. At first went into it wanting it to work, but over time she got more and more uneasy with how everything was unfolding. Then she noticed the differences between the raw internal numbers and the version being shown upward, sat with that, for a while apparently struggled with what to do, then finally brought it to HR, specifically to the HR director. A guy named Peter. She showed him documentation, walked him through how the metrics had been adjusted, and explained why she thought the reporting was no longer honest. This was not sabotage, was not revenge, was not somebody trying to blow up Vanessa's career out of spite. Natalie honestly believed the company needed accurate information if it was going to make good decisions, and she was right. Once the investigation started, it did not take long for things to get ugly. They confirmed the reported figures did not cleanly match the underlying data, and once that was established, it raised bigger questions about the whole experiment, about the judgment behind it, about the way it had been managed, about whether leadership could trust the person who designed it in the first place. Vanessa was eventually asked to step down from the role, not in some loud public humiliation kind of way, but because by then the situation had become impossible to defend. Trust had been damaged in a way that was not going to be fixed with another meeting and a new slide deck within a few weeks. The gender split office was being dismantled. Construction crews came back, the walls came down, and the workspace started getting put back into something much closer to what it had been. Before all this started, after that for months, the whole company was stuck thinking about what had just happened. People talked about it in meetings, talked about it quietly at desks, talked about it over coffee because once the experiment was over, the real question was not just how it failed, it was what exactly everybody was supposed to learn from it. The people who took over after Vanessa were careful about how they talked about the whole mess. They did not frame it as some grand proof that integration is automatically better in every case, and they did not act like the failed experiment had zero useful ideas in it, because that would have been too easy and honestly too shallow. That kind of black and white conclusion would have missed what actually happened. The real focus became figuring out why some workplace structures help people succeed and others quietly sabotage them, and how to build an environment where people can do strong work regardless of gender or background or personality. That was the part that stuck with me the most. I came out of the whole thing way more aware of how much workplace design matters and how fast a well-meaning idea can go sideways when the people implementing it are more focused on theory than on how the job actually gets done. Day to day, Vanessa was not completely wrong about the underlying issue. Some women absolutely do run into real problems in mixed-gender workplaces. That part is real. There is actual research behind it, and plenty of lived experience behind it too. Where she went wrong was the fix. She targeted the wrong variables, and in the process created a bunch of new problems that ended up being worse than the ones she was trying to solve. The answer was never to split people apart. It was to build a setup that leaves room for different working styles while still keeping the collaboration and range of perspectives that make teams stronger in the first place after the walls came down. Claire and I talked a lot about everything that had happened. Those conversations helped me understand parts of it. I had not really seen clearly from my side. She pointed out something that hit me pretty hard. The women's wing had not just been physically separated, it had also been loaded with expectations. The men's wing did not have. They were under pressure to prove a whole concept to somehow model this ideal version of collaborative working. And that pressure shaped behavior in ways that were not natural and definitely were not useful. People were not just doing their jobs, they were also trying to live up to an ideology sitting over the room. The whole time, she said, if both wings had just been given space to settle into their own rhythms, without all that baggage, the outcome might have looked very different. And honestly, I think she was right. The company that came out the other side of all this was, in some ways, better than the one that went into it shaken up. Sure, but smarter. Once leadership actually understood more clearly what helps teams function. They started making changes that addressed the real issues without resorting to something insane, like physical separation. We got new norms around meetings, more structure around when discussions actually needed everyone and when they did not, more protected focus time, clearer expectations around communication, less pointless interruption, less performative collaboration, more attention to how people really work instead of how somebody thinks they should work. And the nice part was, those changes helped basically everybody, men and women, both because they were built around reality, not around some rigid belief system. I still work at Hartwell, same open office again, same kind of mixed teams, tackling difficult client projects, no fake barriers, no absurd social engineering experiment dividing people by category. Sometimes I walk past the area where that wall used to be, and I still remember those weird months when half the office was cut off from the other half. Hard not to think about it. Hard not to think about how much all of us ended up learning from something that failed. That badly failure does teach you stuff, assuming anybody involved is willing to be honest about what actually happened. And to Hartwell's credit, I think the company eventually it forced people to get more thoughtful about workplace design and a lot more humble about how complicated it really is to build an environment where different people can all do good work if you are the kind of person who has any say over office culture. This whole story should probably make you think twice before imposing some big clean theory onto messy real humans. Good intentions do not mean much if the execution ignores how people actually function and what they actually need in order to stay productive and not miserable. The best workplaces are not built on slogans. They are built on understanding, on flexibility, on paying attention, on giving people the conditions to do their jobs well, without boxing them into some idea somebody fell in love with in a strategy meeting. And if you have ever lived through some workplace experiment that blew up in everybody's face, you are probably not the only one. Sometimes the people making those decisions honestly think they are helping. Sometimes they are dead wrong anyway, and usually the only way out is through blunt conversation, real feedback, and some willingness to admit the plan did not work. Not through scapegoating, not through pretending the damage is imaginary. The people I work with now include a lot of the same coworkers who went through that whole mess with me, and I think we understand each other better. Because of it, we got to see what happens when barriers get forced between people who are supposed to work together. And once you have seen that up close, you stop taking normal collaboration for granted. We value the mix on our teams more. Now not just demographic diversity, but different working styles, different instincts, different perspectives, different approaches to solving the same problem. That mix makes us better, but only because now the environment is set up in a way that lets it actually work, instead of slicing people apart and hoping ideology can carry the rest.